the globe on his shoulders, groaning under the curse, under the judgment. We think so mighty Atlas that he holds up the world. Jesus is holding up everything. And it's lighter than a feather to him. Now that's power. All creation exists in utter and total dependence upon the Son. That is why those who would seek to make themselves independent of the Son is like a person on a life support system that the moment he wakes up, he's trying to rip the plug out of the wall. Everything exists in total dependence on the Son. It will never wean itself away from Him. Now think about that. Here's the thing that, let me discuss this with you for a moment. My boys were weaned. My daughter was weaned. My boys, little by little, are learning so as to one day even be weaned from the authority of their father and their mother. I mean, I hold the hands of both my boys when we're walking through the Walmart parking lot. I hope not to do that when they're 16. Okay? This is very important, isn't it? So there's a sense in which in human relationships we desire, as people grow to maturity, that they break off in their dependence. And they become autonomous in a sense. But the Christian life is not that way. Your maturity is not manifested by greater independence. Your maturity is manifested by greater dependence. Do you see that? Greater dependence. So the more that you grow in Him, you're becoming more and more dependent upon the Lord. That's why many times younger ministers can actually be more useful than those with experience. And that is why many times the older prophets become useless and dangerous. You see, you talk to a missionary. I'll never forget Homer Crane. I just dearly loved that man. And his wife went home to be with the Lord last year. Homer was a missionary in Peru. I used to call him the John Wayne of missions. This is the toughest bird you've ever seen in your life. And he could not speak Spanish very well. I mean, even when I knew him. Now, he could preach. Man, when he started preaching, something happened, because then his Spanish got a lot better. But he told me, he was up in I think it was Huánuco or Huancayo. I believe it was Huánuco, up in the mountains, where you can see the stars. And his first sermon in Spanish, he said, Paul, all I could say was the heavens declare the glory of God, look at the stars. And now Homer was sovereign grace and was not an easy believism preacher. You can count on that. But he told me, he said 30-some people seemed to be soundly converted that night. And he said, I'd never seen that before or after in my ministry. And I said, Homer, then why? Never called him Homer, called him Brother Crane. Why? He said, because I absolutely was more dependent upon God than ever in my life. I knew I couldn't speak. Homer knew he could preach. Homer can preach. He's a gifted preacher in English. But he was so limited that he had to throw himself just on the power of God. Okay? One of the problems is sometimes we get into this thing that I'm experienced and I'm mature and this and that, and we become fools. We become fools. True maturity manifests itself in a greater dependence. We don't wean ourselves away from Him. Have you ever noticed that most of the men in the Bible, when they really fell, they didn't fall when they were a young minister? When they were full of zeal? They fell when they were older? When they had some victories under their belt? And began to think that maybe they didn't need to be, they were wiser than they used to be? Be very, very careful. Very careful. Especially if you get some victories under your belt. Why? David he should have been going out there fighting with the kings. He's walking on his roof. Noah, great victory, then falls. Be very very, very careful. Very careful. And just because a man is young does not mean he's unwise. And just because he's inexperienced doesn't mean he's a fool. That's very important. So when you get to be an older preacher, don't despise younger preachers by making blanket statements about them that aren't necessarily true. Because I know some young men much younger than me that are also wiser than me. If you're old, it doesn't mean you're wise. If you're young, it doesn't mean you're stupid. Although there are a lot of stupid young people and a lot of unwise and wise older people. Just remember that. God put Spurgeon in the pulpit when he was 19. That's a phenomenal thing. Probably rarely repeated, but he did. A young person can come into your ministry that maybe even you've established, that God used you to establish that ministry, and God may want to turn it over to him. So always be careful. Always be cautious. Now, the writer of Hebrews tells us that he upholds all things by the word of his power. The power and glory of the Son is such that he upheld and upholds the existence of all things by one command of his mouth. He is not like the mythological Atlas who groans under the weight of a single world, but the Son upholds countless worlds and all their inhabitants with the ease of a single word. He created all things with a word, and he sustains all things with the same. Adam, here's Atlas groaning with all these big muscles, and Jesus is just going, stay up. Sustains everything with a word. You know, we say a word is very light. Not in this case. Not in this case. It is going to take eternities just to even make it to the foothills of the knowledge of God. Albert Barnes writes, the meaning is that they are kept in the present state, their existence, order, and arrangement are continued by his power. If unsupported by him, they would fall into disorder or sink back to nothing. If this be the proper interpretation, then it is the ascription to Christ of infinite power, for nothing less could be sufficient to uphold the universe, and of infinite wisdom, for this is needed to preserve the harmonious action of the suns and systems of which it is composed. None could do this but one who is divine, and hence we see the reason why he is represented as the image of the invisible God. He is the great and glorious and ever-active agent by whom the perfections of God are made known. Him. And then Manton writes, he is not the bare instrument of God in sustaining the creature, but as a co-equal agent. As he made the world, and with the Father created all things, so he doth support and order all things. It is as well the work of the Son as of the Father. For he is God, equal with him in glory and power. My Father worketh hitherto, and I work. John 5:17. And he hath a command of all the creatures that they can do nothing without him, how much soever they attempt to do against him. Look, they can do nothing without him, even though they attempt to do everything against him.